have a contest over whose interpretation of the founders is correct.
Now, we think of the debates as the Lincoln-Douglas debates because Lincoln is such an important figure in our national history. But in 1858, Douglas was a much more prominent figure. And Lincoln was lucky that the national spotlight shone on him because he was combating Douglas.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates are still the most famous debate in American history, and there's a reason for that.
On June 16, 1858, the Illinois Republican Party announced Abraham Lincoln would be its choice for United States Senate. The journey to this moment began 4 years earlier with a piece of legislation that put both Lincoln and the nation at a crossroads.
In his early 40s, that is between the age of 40 and 45, he was losing interest in politics. He was devoting more time to his legal career. And then all of a sudden, he came roaring back into politics because of a dramatic event in Congress.
It's the Nebraska bill. It's the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed in 1854 that brings Lincoln back with full force. He says it roused me like no thing other.
And that allowed slavery to expand into the millions of acres in the territory of the Louisiana Purchase, which is essentially the middle third of the United States between the Mississippi River and the Rockies.
Its author was the 41-year-old senator from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas. Known as the Little Giant, Douglas arrived on the national stage in 1850 after brokering a series of compromise measures that kept the nation from breaking apart. He became the most famous politician in the United States and the presumptive Democratic candidate for president in 1860. His success was built on his signature policy, one that many thought would solve the slavery question once and for all. It was called popular sovereignty.
Stephen Douglas popularized a policy that was actually introduced by a Michigan senator named Lewis Cass, and that policy was popular sovereignty.
Popular sovereignty is Douglas's slogan. It's his platform to emphasize the majesty of the majority in a democracy. Democracy means majority rule.
On the face of it, popular sovereignty sounds as American as mom and apple pie. In other words, who's against the people ruling? Local popular sovereignty, or what was generally known as popular sovereignty, was a policy that said, why don't we apply this rule to the most sensitive, controversial, and divisive issue of our time, whether or not slavery should be allowed in this country, and in particular, should it expand into future states, i.e., current federal territories.
In theory, we'll take slavery out of national politics. It'll become a local, territorial question, and the Union can get on with its business.
So Stephen Douglas, a white northern senator from the free state of Illinois, thought, hey, this is a policy that sells throughout the United States. Now let's let each federal territory decide their domestic institutions for themselves.
Douglas's position was might makes right. If the majority has the power, it ought to have the right to rule.
To allow slavery to move into those territories was a shock to Lincoln and to lots of people in the North. And so it galvanized him to come off the political sidelines. And he said he had always hated slavery as much as any abolitionist, but he hadn't made a big issue of it because he thought slavery was on the road to extinction.
He said the founders were anti-slavery in principle, but they had no power and no opportunity to do away with slavery immediately.
In the past in this country, the early momentum was in favor of freedom. And you do that by stopping its importation, so the supply, if you will, and preventing its expansion, in the hopes that over time, slavery would wither on the vine.
But then all of a sudden, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, suddenly slavery's expanding. It's on the march. And then on top of that, in 1857 comes the Dred Scott decision.
The Dred Scott decision of 1857. This was a decision that the Chief Justice, Roger Brooks Taney, thought would solve the slavery matter for good. This is a case that involved a slave, Dred Scott, who resided in free state and free territories, who came back to his home state of Missouri, a slave state, and then sued for his freedom, saying, hey, I resided in a free state and a free territory. I should be a free person.
Dred Scott meant that a slave owner has a right to take his slave with him into any of the Western territories that he wanted to go, and to keep his slave as a slave, even if the local territorial legislature was anti-slavery and had passed laws against slavery.
If we take a look at the landscape, it looks like all the dominoes are falling in the direction of the slave states. Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allows slavery, possibly through popular sovereignty, into northern territories of Kansas and Nebraska. The 1857 Dred Scott case said Congress can't ban slavery in the federal territories. That's a de facto guarantee that slavery is going to enter there, and those slave territories are going to become slave states.
Well, Lincoln says, the next decision the Supreme Court is going to make is that slaveholders can take their slaves into free states and settle down. And pretty soon the whole country will become a slave country.
But did Lincoln, the self-taught frontier lawyer, really have the pedigree, the education, to take on the biggest problem facing the country?
He was definitely embarrassed by the fact that he grew up in real poverty, that he was very ill-educated. He said that his total sum of formal schooling amounted to less than 1 full year. He was very awkward physically, and he was not physically attractive. And so he had a kind of inferiority complex.
He's this backwoods frontier politician with practically no education. Here's a guy who never went to law school, never went to college, never went to high school. He went to so-called blab schools, it's kind of like Little House on the Prairie school for at the most 12 months total. He's almost completely self-taught.
He always had a sort of envy for people who were able to afford a good education. And he wanted to see an America, an educated citizenship. And that was a very important part of liberty for him, both the economic rise and the educational dignity that would come in the American future.
Abraham Lincoln's relationship with his father was quite strained, and that is most dramatically illustrated when he's informed by his stepbrother, who writes to him and says, "Our father is dying, and he would like to see you." And Lincoln could have gotten there in a day's journey, and instead he writes to his stepbrother and says, "Tell our father that it would be more painful than pleasant if we were to see each other now." The root of that estrangement from his father, I think, is in part because Lincoln, whenever he would go to school as an adolescent, he would be there for a few weeks, and his father would suddenly pull him out and hire him out to neighbors to work. And all the money that Lincoln would make, he would turn over to his father, which was the law of the land. And I think that profoundly affected Lincoln's attitude towards slavery. Because one of the striking things about Lincoln's emergence as an anti-slavery leader in the 1850s is the eloquence with which he denounced slavery and the emphasis that he laid on one particular argument that the anti-slavery forces relied upon. And that is that it was an outrage that somebody went out and worked in the hot sun all day and somebody else derived all the profits.
Lincoln had less than a year's formal schooling, but he had a tremendous appetite for reading and learning and a fabulously retentive memory for both. He was intensely logical and would wrap himself around complicated words and ideas in law and politics so thoroughly that he could afterward explain them with a clarity any farmer could understand. People who listened to Lincoln and Douglas speak were always impressed by Douglas's style, But they were even more impressed with Lincoln's explanations.
The House Divided speech was a very bold and in some respects radical speech. It put him on the map, but it also was like a torch which illuminated what the stakes really were in American politics at the time, that the country really was facing a crisis. The moral case against slavery had been eroding for decades. And rather than proceeding peacefully towards a solution for slavery, we had reached a point where we were going to have to choose.
The way to make sure America doesn't fall is it would have to become united, and united behind one thing or another. Either we don't think the enslavement of black people is a problem and therefore it can be allowed everywhere. That's one way to unite the country. Or we'll solve the crisis by putting slavery back in the course of ultimate extinction, as Lincoln put it. He believed that was what the founders intended all along.
Point number 2 in the House Divided speech is, do not fall for the notion that Stephen A. Douglas is our friend. The central question is slavery right or slavery wrong? But Douglas has never said slavery is wrong.
What's insidious about popular sovereignty is and this is what Stephen Douglas was teaching citizens of Illinois and elsewhere. He says, hey, you don't have to care what happens to people who don't look like you as long as they don't live near you. So we in Illinois shouldn't be hot and bothered about what's happening in Kansas or Nebraska or Oregon while it's a territory. Let them figure that out for themselves. And so white people in the North who would never own a slave themselves could say, well, this doesn't affect me. This doesn't affect my friends and my neighbors. Sure, I'll sign on to that. And Lincoln said, don't you realize if we of the North become insidious, all it will take is a handful of people planting slaves in Kansas, in Nebraska, in Oregon, for those states as territories to eventually vote for a slave constitution. And at that point, Congress won't have anything to do about it. Lincoln has been following Douglas at his speeches, and Douglas would give a speech. Lincoln would sit in the front row, kind of hard to miss. He's 6'4". And when the speech would be over, Lincoln would say, all right, everybody go home and eat. How about we meet back here at 7? And you can hear what I think about what Douglas just said. Lincoln proposed to Douglas that they just continue on the campaign trail together with this dog and pony show, if you will. And Douglas, of course, being the incumbent, thought that was ridiculous. There's no way he was going to agree to that. But he said, how about you stop following me on my campaign trail, and I agree to speak with you in formal debates at the remaining congressional districts. That's how we get 7.
Now, Douglas was not at all eager to accept that challenge, but he felt he had to, lest he looked like a wimp, like a coward. But he wanted to minimize the number of debates he would have to confront Lincoln on, because he knew Lincoln was a very effective speaker. He said to friends that, I know Lincoln's has debating skills, and I'm going to have my hands full. The weaknesses that Lincoln had as he faced Douglas were formidable. Stephen A. Douglas was a household name. He had achieved a kind of fame as the leading spokesman of the Democratic Party. He was more famous than presidents like Pierce and Buchanan. And he was regarded as one of the most formidable debaters in Congress. Douglas also had a lot of money and was willing to spend it on the campaign. Lincoln didn't have much money. The Republican Party didn't have the kind of resources that Douglas was able to muster. He was shameless in his use of political dirty tricks and low blows, and Lincoln was high-minded. He was going to follow the rules of the Marquis of Queensberry, whereas Douglas was going to be an alley fighter.
As Lincoln prepared for the first debate, he knew what they had to accomplish. Winning the fight against slavery required breaking Douglas, uniting Republicans, and doing all of it in a way that made Americans proud of their common heritage. The question was, could he do it?
Each was able to distill the arguments of his position to such a crystalline purity that everyone wanted to taste. Everyone wanted to see for themselves, to taste for themselves what really was agitating the country and what the alternative was.
People, it's astoundingly a huge number of people, thousands and thousands of people coming and standing for the most part for a 3-hour debate. These debates lasted for 3 hours.
On August 21st, 1858, 12,000 people gathered in the city of Ottawa. But they weren't there to see Lincoln. He was a political unknown. They were there for Douglas. And Douglas's opening speech would be his way of explaining what Abraham Lincoln was all about.
Douglas starts off very aggressively and very unscrupulously. He says to Lincoln, "Do you approve of these planks in the Republican platform?" And then, instead of citing the Republican platform, which had been drawn up when the Republican Party in Illinois was founded in 1856, and which Lincoln profoundly affected, he started quoting some Northern Illinois Republican platforms that had been adopted in 1854 by the more radical members of the Illinois electorate in the northern part of the state. And they were calling for more radical things like the abolition of the domestic slave trade and the abolition of the Fugitive Slave Act and the refusal to admit more slave states to the Union, which were considered pretty radical.
Fundamentally, the Republican Party is operating at a massive cultural disadvantage, precisely because they're standing up for the rights of black people. They are being associated with abolitionists. And abolitionists at the time were seen as a fringe element of society. You didn't invite these people to your parties. For example, William Lloyd Garrison, in the most extreme version of abolition, was known to burn a copy of the Constitution in public. You didn't do that back then. You don't mess with the Constitution. Because the Republicans were pro-Constitution, supportive of the rule of law, they could not be tainted with the abolition brush. And so one of the fundamental things he had to do at that first debate, and he had to do it at the remaining 6, was dissociate himself from abolitionism and the party from abolitionism while still sticking by their anti-slavery bona fides. They had to be against slavery, but in a constitutional way.
Lincoln had made sure that when the Republican Party was founded in Bloomington in 1856, that those more radical stands were not part of the party platform. But Douglas then pretended that Lincoln and the Republicans all agreed that the Fugitive Slave Act should be abolished and that the internal slave trade should be abolished and that no more slave states should be admitted to the Union and so forth. Since Douglas was quoting these items verbatim, Lincoln was taken somewhat aback and didn't immediately realize that he was being hoodwinked. So he really put Lincoln back on his heels. And Douglas then went right after Lincoln for the House divided speech, which Douglas said, well, that means Lincoln is calling for war. He wants the South and the North to go to war. And Douglas was absolutely shameless in his appeal to race prejudice. That was the central theme of Douglas's campaign, an appeal to negrophobia, that resentment of blacks, hatred of blacks was pretty widespread throughout the country in those years. But it was particularly acute in Illinois. Arguably, Illinois was the most negrophobic state in the North.
Douglas painted Lincoln as a self-interested politician who cared more about his own career than the good of the nation. Lincoln wanted to defend himself, and he spent more time doing that than attacking Douglas and his policies.
In 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were a local election for Senate from the state of Illinois, but they were on a national stage. And in a strange way, everyone seemed to realize that pretty quickly.
The audience that was gathered in towns that the debates took place in was minuscule compared to the national audience that was exposed to the debates through the medium of the shorthand reporters and the willingness of newspapers throughout the country to print the entire debates verbatim.
Considering that each of these is a 3-hour-long debate, transcribed in the newspapers and apparently eagerly read, not just in Illinois, but reprinted elsewhere in the country and noticed even in New York newspapers, testifies to how eager the public was for political talent, even in 1858.
America was experiencing a technological transformation. Railroads roared across the landscape. By the mid-1850s, the United States had nearly as much rail mileage as the rest of the world combined. travel time from Chicago to New York went from a month to 2 days. The telegraph, invented in 1844, was connecting city to city and state to state in a web of near instant communication. 50,000 miles of wires went up in 15 years. Advances in powered printing resulted in a newspaper boom. There were 5 Illinois papers in 1824. By 1853, there were 161. Nationwide, 500 million newspapers circulated annually. Innovations in stenography allowed political speech to be recorded as it happened, filling those papers with more immediate reporting than ever before. Douglas was already a star, but this new technology, this rapid information network, would transform an obscure frontier lawyer into the nation's first political mass media sensation, and America would never be the same.
Well, after the first debate, Lincoln's advisors said, you have to go on the offensive. Don't let Douglas put you back on your heels. He posed a number of questions to you and said, you've got to answer these. Well, in the second debate, answer them, but then pose a lot of questions to him and don't let up. Charge, Chester, charge was the motto that he should adopt.
Within a week, Republicans from around the country could read the words of a politician with little name recognition and official stature, and Democrats could read the speeches of their most famous politician, a reality that would come to haunt Douglas after the debate in Freeport.
The second debate takes place also in northern Illinois in the town of Freeport. And once again, a huge crowd turns out, as had happened in Ottawa. The weather was unfavorable, overcast, and not as agreeable as it had been in Ottawa. But you had people coming not just from the town itself, but from all parts of northern Illinois.
Lincoln has had time now to think about what he calls these interrogatories that Douglas puts to him. And these interrogatories or questions are designed to make Lincoln and the Republican Party look like they are not friends of the South, make them look like they're the dividers in this country, they're the agitators, they're making slavery a bigger deal than everybody else thinks it is.
Lincoln takes the offensive and poses some questions to Douglas. Of the questions that Lincoln posed, there were 4 questions. One was particularly important.
One of the questions that Lincoln asked Douglas is, you are this great supporter of the Dred Scott opinion. You say whatever the Supreme Court says, it's like, thus saith the Lord. We have to obey it whether we agree or not. You're such a supporter of the Supreme Court and a supporter of the Dred Scott opinion, and it's an opinion that says that in the territories, anybody has a federal right, according to the Fifth Amendment, to take their slaves there and have it protected. How does that square with your popular sovereignty policy? Where, as we all know, popular sovereignty says this isn't Congress's business, it's not even the court's business. It's the local population's business whether they want slavery or not. Lincoln knows the answer like a good lawyer before he asks the question, but he wants it to be public and he wants it in the newspapers, and he knows that folks back in the Northeast and in the South are now paying attention. Douglas guffaws and goes, good grief, Lincoln, you've heard me answer this question hundreds of times. You know what my answer is. And Douglas, to his credit and to maintain his integrity, he puts all his eggs in the popular sovereignty basket.
This revealed something to the South that they hadn't understood before. Namely, Douglas was selling popular sovereignty, his panacea, to the South as, in effect, a pro-Southern position. But now, all of a sudden, popular sovereignty looks like it could be pro-Northern, that the settlers could move out, and even though they couldn't, through their representatives in Congress, prohibit slavery from coming in, they could defeat the will of the court and Congress by sitting on their hands.
He will not commit to supporting the Dred Scott opinion over his pet policy of popular sovereignty. And Douglas now has become public enemy number 1 of Southern Democrats.
After Freeport, Lincoln and his advisors were confident that Douglas could not carry the South in 1860. But for Lincoln to carry Illinois in 1858, he needed to answer a question that Douglas was putting to him and the whole Republican Party. Did being against slavery mean being for voting rights?
Lincoln, in his last public speech on April 11, 1865, calls for black voting rights. He says, I believe black people should be allowed to vote, at least those who have served in ranks and those who are very intelligent. Frederick Douglass was in the audience that day, and Frederick Douglass said that he and his abolitionist friends were very disappointed because of the limited scope of Lincoln's endorsement of black suffrage, just the veterans of the Army and the very intelligent. But Frederick Douglass said in a speech later in 1865, he said, we should have known that that was a very significant speech because Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. And then you take a maul, a giant hammer, and you drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And we should have known that on that day, April 11th, 1865, Lincoln was inserting the thin edge of the wedge. But we should have known that once Lincoln inserted the thin edge of the wedge, you could count on him to drive home the thick edge of the wedge.
Lincoln thinks, I've got to start with where people are at. Government by consent, alas, is government by people's opinions. And guess what? Their opinions are shaped by their prejudices. Here's the question. What do we do? What did Lincoln do? What did Republicans do with regards to prejudices that many of them didn't agree with? They said, let's start with that prejudice and try to build a bridge to a better way of thinking. Douglass, in every one of his statements, only reinforces and entrenches those prejudices. Lincoln, slowly, with nuance, and assiduously tries to say, I see where you're coming from, and to an extent, I have voted along those lines, but can you consider this over here? What's your take on the Declaration? Correct me if I'm wrong on this. Doesn't this sound universal? Doesn't this sound like the best way to think about your own rights?
I mean, you're struggling, you're imperfect. And it is very hard for an imperfect being to live up perfectly to a set of moral propositions. But as long as you acknowledge them and hallow them as perfect or as true, and you try to improve, you move towards fulfilling them, you are a conscientious believer. You're neither a hypocrite nor an unbeliever, let's say, or a racist. And that's basically a Lincoln's position, attempting immediately to rush towards the perfect realization of a moral commandment, as many of the abolitionists were calling for, would be to destroy the Union.
This is the obstacle. This was the mountain that Lincoln and the Republicans were trying to climb in 1858. They had to be against slavery, but in a constitutional way. Stephen Douglas had the luxury of speaking to most whites in Illinois who were bigots.
A small town of fewer than 1,000 people, Jonesboro was the center of what was one of Illinois' poorest and most illiterate counties. It also had the state's highest concentration of people born in slaveholding states.
A lot of the population had come from southern slave states. And so if Illinois is a white supremacist state, the deep south portion of Illinois is that in all capital letters. Douglas says, yeah, Lincoln can say all he wants up north in Chicago, or maybe even in Freeport, but wait till I trot you down to Cairo, wait till I trot you down to Jonesboro. I want to see if you're all pro-Negro, to use the locution of the day, down there. Douglas claims that Lincoln says one thing about the Declaration in the North and another thing down south, so he doesn't make the Republican Party look like they love black people. He is advised by his counselors fairly early that your statements on behalf of black people are killing us. Anything that you say that sounds like black people should be treated equally, maybe even vote. That is losing us votes. That is losing us with populations. We are getting complaints. You got to back off that.
Lincoln was very careful to be accommodating and respectful of his political opponents. That kind of magnanimity and that kind of gentlemanliness characterized Lincoln for the most part throughout the debates, but not at Jonesboro. Douglas, for example, said he had so vanquished Lincoln at an earlier debate that he had to be carried off the stage, that he had been unnerved and unmanned by Douglas's assault. And Lincoln said, that's nonsense. Those were my friends who thought that I had won the debate and they were carrying me off in triumph. For Douglas to allege that I was trembling in my boots and was unable to walk is such an outrageous lie that I don't know what else to do except to shut him up by putting a corncob in his mouth.
As the two candidates traveled through southern Illinois, they were accompanied by Donati's Comet. One fellow traveler said that Lincoln spent over an hour just looking at it. The self-educated logician cared about where things came from. It was in that light he looked at all questions. And it was in this light that he would begin his speech at Charleston.
The third debate in Jonesboro drew a very small crowd. It was a small town. There was not much interest or enthusiasm one way or the other. But in the fourth debate in Charleston, Illinois, a huge crowd turned out.
In Charleston, you see Lincoln compelled by this white supremacist context to say what he's in favor of and what he's not in favor of.
He said, as I said in the opening debate in Ottawa, I do not believe in social equality for blacks. I believe that the laws on the books that forbid blacks to hold office, to vote, to serve on juries, or to intermarry with whites are valid, and I support that. I do believe, however, that just because I don't believe in political equality, that I don't therefore believe that they should be enslaved. And this passage has then become very famous. It's celebrated all the time to prove that Lincoln was a hopeless racist and that, in fact, segregationist senators at the turn of the 20th century, as they supported Jim Crow laws, cited Lincoln's statements. And it is something that cries out for analysis.
Now remember, Stephen Douglas is categorically white supremacist. That's nothing to see here. In Illinois, that is not a big deal. That's garden variety stuff. Lincoln has to talk about the Declaration in a way that even bigoted white people see. It is just that they grant natural rights, the protection of the rights of nature to blacks, the few blacks that live in Illinois. And so Lincoln is compelled under this attack to admit that he has never been in favor of or is in favor of past, present. Doesn't say anything about the future. I have not been, nor am I pledged to pursue the vote for black people. And so he is forced to say some things that, yes, to our 21st century ear, rings a bit harshly.
What Lincoln was doing at that point was saying, look, the issue before us in Illinois in 1858 is not whether black people should be allowed to serve on juries or vote or hold office or intermarry with whites. That's just not on the table. The question before us is slavery right or is slavery wrong?
Lincoln, when he talks about blacks, he never says that they are naturally the inferior to whites. And all of the statements he says, he hems, he haws, he qualifies, and he always concludes by saying, they may not be equal in these respects. Moral developments, education, all the things that of course depend not on nature, but the environment, the conditions under which you grow up. He always concludes by saying, but in their natural rights, they are my equal, Judge Douglas's equal, and the equal of every white man. And for me, what's astounding is not so much that Lincoln is not in favor of giving the vote to black people. That's a matter of prudence at that time, given the prejudicial climate. What's astounding is that Lincoln has not a single black vote that he can cater to. And yet, he keeps talking about the Declaration of Independence as if it applies to blacks. What his counselors don't understand, Lincoln is trying to get white people to understand that unless they read the Declaration of Independence the way the fathers wrote it and the way they intended it, something that does include everybody. Unless they do that, the ground of their own rights will be pulled out from underneath them.
The last three debates, which are really the most significant in philosophical terms, Lincoln has already tactically peeled the Southerners away from Douglas's coalition by getting Douglas to acknowledge that his popular sovereignty doctrine is really not pro-Southern after all. But now Lincoln is, starting in the Galesburg debate, is emphasizing the larger issues of what the country stands for, what the Declaration of Independence really means, what the slavery debate is really all about.
At Galesburg, it was time for Lincoln to focus his arguments and the people's attention on a single idea. For Lincoln did not believe he could beat Douglas without winning the argument over the true meaning of equality.
As the national debate moved on to the question of slavery and the status of slavery, he became more eloquent on the subject of the Declaration of Independence and on equality and liberty as two sides of the same American coin. You couldn't have one without the other. The basic argument that Jefferson and others made in the Declaration, because we are all members of the same species, we're all equally human beings, we're all equally free. It's the two go together. Equality and liberty reinforce each other in that understanding. And that makes the Declaration and the Constitution, to the extent that it attempts to implement the principles of the Declaration, an anti-slavery document.
Stephen Douglas was someone who did not talk about the Declaration of Independence very much. I think he was forced to do so because Lincoln brought it up. Republicans brought it up so often. What he did bring up a lot is something that the Republicans and almost everybody did, which is their reverence for what they call the fathers. Everybody wants to, or most people want to bear the mantle of Washington, to bear the mantle of the Revolution, to bear the mantle of the beginnings of this great country. And so when Douglas brings up the Declaration, believe me, he doesn't want to talk about all men are created equal. Lincoln forces him to do that because Lincoln says all men really does mean all. And Douglas says, that's poppycock. How could it be all when the guy who wrote it didn't free his slaves? Madison didn't free his slaves. Washington didn't free his slaves. If we are to continue to honor their legacy and honor their achievement, we have to read their profession through their practice. And because they failed to emancipate immediately, then we must therefore interpret all men are created equal and other similar statements through that lens. They must not have meant all. And so that's where it gives Douglas license to say, obviously all doesn't mean all, because if it did, black people would have been freed immediately.
Lincoln is indignant at Douglas and Democrats in general for minimizing the significance of the Declaration of Independence by saying that it really means not all men are created equal, but all Europeans are created equal. Well, Lincoln says that's not what they said. If they meant all Europeans are created equal, they would have said that. But they said all men are created equal.
Lincoln was astounded that these slaveholders recognized that if they were going to have a legitimate reason for breaking away from Great Britain, that reason could not be found in what happened to be an arbitrary characteristic like their skin color, or their religion, or their point of origin or birth. It was their humanity. We hold these truths, notice, to be self-evident, to be manifest, that all men are created equal. In other words, even before we think about what government is supposed to do, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by what? Government? No, by their creator, with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, Lincoln saw that and wondered, wow, you're born with this super valuable thing, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but what don't you get from God or from nature is the safe enjoyment and exercise of these things. For that, you have to create a government. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Lincoln marveled at that and said, you know what? As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This Lincoln wrote in a note to himself, trying to sum up what was the key principle of the Declaration and therefore the American regime. And that principle was, if I want to be secure to exercise my rights and my freedom that I have simply by being a human, that means I have to agree to allow other people to be secure in theirs.
When the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal, clearly they didn't mean all men are equally tall, or all men are equally intelligent, or all men are equally talented, but meant that all people should be allowed to progress as far as their talent and ability and industry and virtue will take them, the right to rise. And that's what the founders were up to, Lincoln said. And they set this standard of all men are created equal, not as something that necessarily existed at the time, but was a standard to be striven for.
That's what leads to the social compact that produces the only just form of government, civil government, government by consent of the governed. That's what led Lincoln to see that slavery had to go in this country.
But there was one voting bloc that needed more than theoretical arguments, that needed to understand why slavery, for one group of people, affected the future and prosperity of all Americans.
In the Quincy debate, the sixth debate, it takes place in central Illinois on the Mississippi River, where the key voting bloc is the old Whigs. That is, the Whig Party has disappeared, and in 1856, a lot of the old Whigs, in the absence of the Whig Party, were unwilling to go so far as to join the Republican Party.
Those are what we call today the independent voters. Most of those people are former Whigs, but that doesn't make them Republicans, right? When these former Whigs, they talk to their neighbors are not abolitionists. And so they're like, Republican Party, I've heard they're abolitionists. And so, they can't say out loud that they're in favor of what the Republican Party is because they've been tagged with that abolitionist brush. Whigs believe in a vigorous national government. They're the party of Henry Clay, the party of the American system. They're the party that believes that the national government can fund infrastructure, as we say today. Back then, they called that internal improvements.
Chief among those internal improvements was the railroads. In the railroads, Stephen Douglas saw the nation's future prosperity, so long as the nation didn't let one disagreement get in the way.
Stephen A. Douglas believed that popular sovereignty would allow the opening of territory to railroad expansion. He said, look, in 1850, we acquired a huge hunk of territory from Mexico, including California. It's up to us now to link that part of the nation with the rest of the nation. The way to do that is through railroads.
We could continue to grow and grow stronger and more powerful in the world if we didn't allow this small domestic issue, slavery, to distract us. And the way to sideline it was also the way to solve it. That is, turn it into a purely local question. From his point of view, that was the statesmanlike thing to do, and it was the only solution consistent really with his own understanding of democracy as almost entirely a matter of majority will.
Once we began to have our leading politicians, once a northern free state senator, Stephen Douglas, the leading Democrat, the leading politician, I would argue, of America, once men like him said, slavery, freedom, indifferent, as long as you don't make slaves of white people, we're good. Once Lincoln saw that, and Lincoln himself obviously was a white man, he says, you don't understand. If you make race the ground of your rights, why can't somebody else pick some other arbitrary characteristic? Today, it's, are you a black person or a white person? Tomorrow, it'll be, are you a Protestant or are you a Catholic? A year from now, if it's a different majority, how will you make sure that you are always in the majority?
Lincoln is in favor of a free society in all of its dimensions, but especially a society based on the right of private property and the right to rise as far and as fast as your talents and your attractiveness in the marketplace will allow you to rise. That powerful theme of upward mobility is essential to Lincoln's view of the American future.
Lincoln said, in this country, we have to put all our political eggs in the basket of the minority of one, and that minority is the individual. If you're an individual human being, every single one of you has rights that you were born with, and they're not dependent on any of your arbitrary characteristics.
If you don't allow slavery to spread in the West, what do you get? You get an incredible economic dynamism, incredible room for generations and generations of Americans and of immigrants to America to come and to go as far as their talents and their luck will allow them to.
On October 15th, the two candidates met for the final time in Alton. This was Whig country. They cared about the rule of law above all else, and they believed that the rule of law's strongest advocate was Stephen Douglas.
Lincoln recognizes that at Alton, this is going to be the last truly formal chance he has to make his case for his own candidacy and against the leading Democrat and odds-on favorite to become the next president of the United States, Stephen Douglas. What Lincoln does at Alton, and he only gets one chance to do it. Remember, the terms of the debate are you have an opener, a rebutter, and then a rejoinder by the opener. So Douglas is going to get to have the first and last word at Alton. And so Lincoln's hour and a half has to be used well.
Lincoln comes full circle because he goes back to the Chicago speech, the great speech he gives on July 10th, 1858. He uses an image about the divine right of kings. And he said, the debate between Douglas and me really is like the debate that's gone on for centuries over the divine right of kings. That there are some people, like the king, who's divinely inspired, who is entitled to say, you toil and I'll eat.
Lincoln said, "It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, the other, the divine right of kings. It is the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It is the same spirit that says, you toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it. No matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle."
My job, says Douglas, is to carry out the will of the people. If they want to create a slave state, I'm all for that. If they want to go create a free state, I'm in favor of that too. But that's not for me to say. His position was a sort of almost value-free position. The majority will decide what is right and what is wrong for them. And as a statesman, my only job is to carry out their will. I am an instrument of their will, and really not much more. For Lincoln, that was a fundamental abrogation of both of the nature of citizenship in a democratic polity, but also and particularly of the nature of leadership or statesmanship. The people have a right to rule themselves, but they must do so consistently with the basis of their own rights. And he thought the job of the statesman was to remind the people of the difference between right and wrong.
What Lincoln feared in slavery was not just the dehumanization of the black man, but the inevitable revival it heralded of the entire apparatus of hierarchy, of superiors and inferiors, of dependence and patronage rather than achievement and self-transformation, of a society stagnating in the swamp of racial or economic or social privilege. He would say time and again, in America, there were no permanent classes. The hired worker of today could hire his own workers tomorrow. Only in a society of equals did Lincoln say that such a thing was possible.
And the closing thing he wants to show people about Douglas is precisely how much Douglas, in principle, really is preaching to the country to act like abolitionists, which is to say, not to get rid of slavery, per se, although Lincoln would love that. It's Douglas is actually teaching people to act like abolitionists in their undermining of the rule of law. If locally the population of a territory wants to ban slavery, they could, quote, pass unfriendly legislation, end quote. They can exercise what are known as the police powers, right? The power to promote the safety, health, welfare, and morals of the community. They can do that in a way that if the majority there doesn't want slavery, they can get rid of it, regardless of what the Supreme Court says. And Lincoln says, funny, there's no one in the state of Illinois like Judge Douglas who's more of an abolitionist than Judge Douglas, because Stephen Douglas is actually saying something that is the principle that is driving abolitionists' resistance against the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law that they think is a moral abomination, and they are passing laws to resist that at the local level. Douglas has just said it's all right to do that. In fact, there's nothing more American. And so Lincoln ends his formal remarks in the Lincoln-Douglas debates with tarring Douglas with the same brush that he's been tarred and the Republican Party has been tarred, which is the brush of abolitionism, which, all other things being equal, is the kiss of political death in 1858. A true October surprise happens to Lincoln. And what happens is a letter is released, a letter that John Crittenden, very popular and renowned old line Whig from Kentucky, Crittenden is solicited by members of Douglas's team to say something favorable towards Douglas, and not endorsing Douglas per se, but being favorable towards him as a politician.
If you look at the actual votes for the candidates for the House and the Senate of the Illinois State Legislature, and you assume that each Republican vote was a vote for Lincoln, and each Democratic vote was a vote for Douglas, and you total all those votes up, you would see that Lincoln would have won handily. It would have been something like 55 to 45%. But because of the structure of the voting, because of the malapportionment, because of the fact that the legislature chose the candidates, not the direct election of senators by vote, Lincoln felt that he probably wasn't going to win, and he didn't.
Lincoln writes this letter to Crittenden, and it's a letter where it doesn't take much to read between the lines. He says to Crittenden, I know you didn't do this on purpose, and I know that you would never have done anything to essentially overplay your influence in this debate, but I gotta tell you, I'm not sure it really helped me a whole lot. And that was Lincoln's way of saying, you're killing me, Smalls. That's the closest Lincoln could say to get to saying you're killing me, Smalls. But he essentially said that to this elder statesman, Crittenden, and that being for him the tipping point why a number of people ultimately just could not bring themselves to pull the lever to put their X on a Republican ballot. I think the abolitionist brush was just too much for the Republicans to bear up. What he does like, though, is he says this debate and this campaign was worth it because now Douglas is doomed in the South. If he's the Democratic candidate, they're going to force him to commit to a federal slave code to the territories, which is anathema to him because he's such a local popular sovereignty guy.
But in the moment, Douglas considered the election results a total vindication of his policy. And so in January of 1859, when Douglas found out by telegraph that the Illinois State Legislature had officially reelected him, Douglas had no better way to respond to the victory than with the single phrase, "Let the voice of the people rule."
To say, let the voice of the people rule, of course, it's his way of saying, well, what do you know? The guy who believes in the will of the people has, by the will of the people, been appointed their next senator. That's popular sovereignty. So in a way, he's trying to say to folks, look at how we did it in Illinois. Residents of territories should not be treated any less than that. We have that right, so do they. Again, as long as that right is exercised by white people.
If people really want to see and to appreciate what white supremacy meant and what the argument against it was, the successful argument against it ultimately, politically, was, they need to look at the Lincoln-Douglas debates and to look at how serious Douglas is in pressing that principle and how serious and masterly Lincoln is at refuting that principle.
With his Senate election over, Douglas could now look to what he had always considered the ultimate prize. But it did not take long for Douglas to realize that Southern members had lost confidence in him as an advocate of slavery.
In 1859, it was all about who's going to be the next president, and the most important question was not who's going to be the next Republican nominee, it's who's going to be the next Democratic nominee. Douglas says, I will be their candidate, but if they ask me to commit to a plank of the party that says we have to support legislation guaranteeing the right to own slaves in the territories, in the federal territories. In other words, as the product not of the territorial legislature, but as the product of Congress's action, Douglas says, find somebody else. So to his credit, he has put all his eggs in the popular sovereignty basket.
And when the 1860 Democratic National Convention meets, the Southern delegates are so mad that they said, we're not going to adopt a platform that doesn't have a federal slave code, which means that Stephen A. Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine is nullified. And that if we don't get that federal slave code in the platform, we're going to break up the party. And that's just what happens. Lincoln had put him in a position where his vulnerability on his southern flank became much more prominent. And so in the short run, Lincoln loses. In the long run, he wins.
On February 27, 1860, Abraham Lincoln delivered an address to 1,500 people at New York's Cooper Union. Lincoln chose this speech as the moment to explain what the American founders actually thought of slavery and how their view was consistent with the view of the Republican Party.
He is making the case for the House divided strategy, that the issue is slavery and its extension, that there's no getting around that, and that we need to be absolutely clear about the moral dimensions of that question. But above all, that we have the confidence as Republicans to make the case for freedom.
What he's trying to do nationally is give the Republican Party a good name. He needs to show that they are an anti-slavery party, but they're not abolitionists. And therefore, what they've got to get Americans to agree to is slavery is wrong. No, don't hasten to say that therefore you have to abolish it everywhere. We don't have the authority to do that. Love to see you Southerners do that. By all means, Godspeed. But we've got to, as a country, admit that the founders founded a republic. And slavery was this pre-existing condition we couldn't get rid of right away, but that doesn't mean we can't put it back on the course of ultimate extinction.
He shows with a brilliant historical analysis that, in fact, the framers did believe that Congress had the power to prohibit slavery in the territories. And then he goes on from that to deal with the Southern threat of secession, which he says is entirely unjustified.
And then the shortest part, but the closing part, the part that people most remember in the speech, is an appeal to Republicans. And it's where he has that wonderful line. He says, let us have faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us dare to do our duty as we understand it. To have faith that right makes might. What Lincoln is actually doing is not simply making a capital R Republican appeal. He's making a lowercase Republican appeal. He's actually teaching the country, this is the central premise of our democracy, of our republic. If we don't look at politics as right informing the exercise of political might, what is the only alternative? It's popular sovereignty. If Americans ever begin to believe that the exercise of might is what dictates what is right, then we will have pulled the rug out from underneath the principles that inform our government, which is to say that yes, the majority rules, but they must always respect the rights of the individual. The most important minority in America has always been the numerical minority of one.
On Tuesday, November 6, 1860, over 80% of eligible voters went to the polls. Once the man who would be president, Douglas was one of 4 men on the ballot.
Douglas, to his great credit, goes to the South and says, if Lincoln wins the election, it'll be fair and square, and you shouldn't break up the Union. That's no justification for secession. And Douglas was not real popular in the South. It took a lot of nerve for him to go down to New Orleans and elsewhere to make these arguments.
Despite not appearing on the ballot in 10 southern states, Abraham Lincoln carried 18 states in what was a completely sectional election. Lincoln won the North, along with California and Oregon. John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party won Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and John C. Breckinridge won Maryland and the entire South. Stephen Douglas won just one state, Missouri.
When Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, he comes out on the platform on the east portico of the Capitol. And there's a table and chairs, and Douglas is sitting in a chair near a little table where Lincoln can put his glasses and the like. But he doesn't know quite where to put his hat. And Douglas then takes his hat, and it's a very symbolic gesture. And then Douglas, again, to his credit, says after Lincoln delivers his first inaugural address that that's a statesmanlike address, the country should rally around. And then one of the great tragedies of Lincoln's administration is Douglas dies in June of 1861. And if he had lived, he could have given the administration a lot of the same support he was giving it at that time. But in the absence of Douglas, there was nobody of his stature to step in who had that kind of nationalistic point of view. And so the Lincoln-Douglas story, one of the tragic aspects of it is Douglas's premature death really hurt Lincoln when he was serving as president during the war.
On April 11th, 1865, 2 days after the surrender of the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee, Abraham Lincoln delivered his victory speech in front of the White House. He had kept the Union together and emancipated the slaves. It was now time to begin splitting the rail for civil equality and black voting rights in America. Like the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, there were many in the audience who failed to realize the significance of Lincoln's words.
There was one man in the audience who did realize that it was a really significant speech, and that was a charismatic young actor named John Wilkes Booth. And he turns to his colleagues and says, by God, that means black citizenship. That's the last speech he's ever going to give. By God, I'm going to run him through. And 3 days later, he does that. He shoots Lincoln, not because Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and not because Lincoln supported the 13th Amendment, but because he called for black voting rights. And therefore, I think it's appropriate for us in the 21st century to think of Lincoln as a martyr to black civil rights, just as much as Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or any of those people who were murdered back in the 1960s as they championed the civil rights era of that time.
No one in 1854 might have marked Abraham Lincoln for anything but a talented lawyer and perhaps a U.S. senator. His campaign against Stephen Douglas revealed for the first time how thoroughly Lincoln had grasped the issues of his day and how powerful were the principles that guided him. And after 1858, the whole American nation began to notice. The Lincoln-Douglas debates became the stepping stone to the Republican presidential nomination just 18 months later, and the beginning of the most challenging presidency in American history.
Reading Lincoln, studying Lincoln is a way to be reminded of human greatness and American greatness. Lincoln is a great gift to America in many ways because he so sums up what America is at its best and what American politics can be at its best.
I don't think there is a more important voice to listen to, more important words to read than those uttered by our most iconic president, Abraham Lincoln. In Lincoln's time, the American people were beginning to lose the language of the founding. They were beginning to lose a way of speaking about themselves as fellow citizens that reminded each other of their common purpose, their common humanity, and by which they would secure their common possession of their individual rights, right? The government of all should be the favorite of none. Today, we don't hear that language very much. We've all become, in a way, Stephen Douglas today. We think that it's all about being in the majority, and that's the only thing that will make you safe. So much of what Lincoln has to teach us, both in the way of principle and in the way of practice. How do we secure the rights of all, the protection of life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness? The how is as important as the what. And I think what Lincoln learned from the founding and tried to apply in his own day, we would do well to heed today.
And Lincoln shows you the essence. He shows you how you can have the greatest kind of noble soul in a regime dedicated to the common man. But it turns out that the regime of the common man needs very uncommon men, very uncommon persons sometimes, to save it and to remind it of what it's supposed to be. Lincoln's ability to show us the uncommon greatness of the common man or of the cause of the common man is unparalleled.
On June 1st, 1865, which is the last full day of mourning for Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass gives a speech in Cooper Union, hello, the premier place in the country to give a speech. And this speech, which is omitted from his collected works, in this speech he says, Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president. So, whoa, emphatically the black man's president, the first to rise above the prejudice of his time and his country, the first to recognize the manhood and citizenship of black people, and he meant to treat them that way. You know, whoa.
It was the American idea itself that was the biggest barrier to racism and to white supremacy. America is systemically just rather than systemically unjust. That was Lincoln's argument from the very beginning, from the Declaration of Independence. The whole history of the country would ultimately be determined by the attempt to realize, to live up to the systemic justice at the heart of the American political system.
How do we get to justice? How do we get to right? How do we secure the rights of all, the protection of life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness? The how is as important as the what. And I think what Lincoln learned from the founding and tried to apply in his own day, we would do well to heed today.